I'm Iris Pastor here with Clifford Chanin for a little small talk. And to commemorate Yom HaShoah, which is Holocaust Remembrance Day, Cliff is going to be speaking this Sunday, April 11th at 2 p.m. at the Florida Holocaust Museum. And his talk is entitled Holocaust Memory in a Time of Forgetting. Welcome, Cliff.
Very good to be with you, Iris.
Thank you. That title speaks to me. It's chilling and it's sad at the same time. And you mentioned that there's a great deal of fear that the Holocaust will be forgotten with the passage of time. And as the last survivors die off, are we then entering a time of forgetting? And how do you describe that time of forgetting?
Well, it's certainly logical to think so, that one could think sort of naturally that the opposite of remembering is forgetting. But one of the things I will talk about on Sunday is the idea that the memory of the Holocaust has taken root as a separate phenomenon, really, from the Holocaust itself. And this memory of the Holocaust has filtered through more than 60 years of life in the Jewish community, but also in the global community. And so I do think, while we might fear, sometimes with good reason, that the Holocaust will be forgotten, I don't think it actually will be. And there are many reasons to say that would support, I think, that argument.
One of the things that you mentioned that I wanted a little clarification on was that it's going to be passing out of history because the survivors and the eyewitnesses are dying off, and it's going to go into memory. Could you clarify what you mean by that?
Sure. With the death of the survivor generation, unfortunately, there will no longer be a living link, an authentic living link to the experience of having gone through and survived the Holocaust. And this is, an enormous bridge that needs to be crossed in terms of infusing memory into and cementing memory in terms of how people think about the Holocaust in the future. But that said, the last 60 years have been a period of enormous effort by the survivor generation to try to find ways to, if not keep themselves alive indefinitely, unfortunately that can't be the case, but to try to think about how the impact of what they went through is going to survive them. And I think to a considerable degree, this has been successful, and certainly younger generations, which now come into contact with the memory of the Holocaust as a phenomenon itself, will be the beneficiaries of that 60 years of effort.
If you're involved in the Legacy Project, which is a nonprofit organization that deals with the aftermath of Holocaust-type events, and you're also involved with the September 11th Memorial Museum. And that being said, I'm sure you've given a lot of thought to these type of occurrences, and I was wondering if you could talk about how, in order for something like this to take place, there has to be, the old order has to kind of fall by the wayside, and a new hierarchy has to be established. And I was wondering if you could relate that to what happened to the Holocaust and the events leading up to the Holocaust.
Well, one of the things that's, the Holocaust gives an example of, and the Holocaust really, it's got this sort of dual meaning, because it's absolutely a unique event, but because it's a unique event, people look at it, it becomes an example of things, because once you create something unique, it's a new standard by which other things can be judged. So that, I don't want to call it a double standard because that has a different meaning, but that dual meaning has really evolved quite a bit over the 60 of the Holocaust, 60 plus years. The idea of the rise of the Nazis and this absolute totalitarian rule in Germany for those 12 years, that in retrospect or in reaction, created this desire to completely overthrow the means by which such a terrible thing could have been built, could have been structured in a society. And so, again, this comes back to the imagination. People had to imagine a world where this would not be able to happen again. They could no longer imagine a world where such a thing couldn't happen. They had to then think about a world where such a thing couldn't happen again. And that's really an enormous, enormous jump.
So
I
one of the things that you had talked about was that there had to be this decline in a hierarchy, and there had to be local help, which of course the Nazis, did get the German people to kind of collaborate with this. But you talk about how you need a communications like system, or you need effective communication, and that they had that. And I thought that was interesting because we've read so many accounts where people didn't know what was happening, and newspapers were burying the articles in the middle pages and not putting what was happening to the Jews on the front pages. So I wanted to know what effective means of communications were you referring to?
Sure. Well, this also borrows from Anderson, but he says that for this so-called imagined community to come together, some kind of new technology needs to bring them a message that they hadn't been able to get before. And unfortunately, as you make clear, there was no such technology that made this difference during the Holocaust itself. But a fascinating thing happens. The newsreel images, both the moving pictures and the still photos, but really more the moving pictures, they create this impact because they can somehow bring a very distant audience into a real confrontation with the event. And that, again, is a first. It happens after the Holocaust. Unfortunately, it didn't happen in such a way to limit the damage of the Holocaust, but it happens after the Holocaust. And this new technology, which is the newsreel, which was not a brand new technology, but it was a technology that relatively new that brought these images to a mass public for the first time. And that had an enormous, enormous impact. And you mentioned 9/11. It's another example, because one of the things that's striking about 9/11, many, many years after the Holocaust, is this was probably the most visually documented event in history. More people saw it live, and more people photographed or filmed it than any event that we know of. And this has had a huge impact in the world as well because of how many people actually watched it in real time. It's one of those events where 99.9% of the people you'll ask will know exactly where they were when 9/11 happened, and they'll tell you what it was like, and so on and so forth. And that kind of common experience, that kind of collective experience, does create what Anderson referred to as a kind of imagined community.
I heard someone make the comment that if we had the technology we had today with text messaging and cell phones and email and internet, that the Holocaust would never have been able to happen and to go to the point that it did. What do you think about that?
Well, that's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought of that myself, but we'll think about it this way. I mean, again, I'm not trying to compare historical events. I'm trying to compare, the phenomenon of this sort of mass technology reaching everywhere. If you think back to the demonstrations in Iran, presidential election, and all of the twittering and all of the internet videos that were distributed. I mean, the Iranian government tried very, very hard to clamp down on any kind of general awareness of what they were doing in the streets of Iran to the demonstrators. And yet the media, the mass media, didn't do it. These personal media did.
Cliff, I want to thank you very much for being with us today and providing your wisdom. It certainly was eye-opening. And again, Cliff will be expounding on the topic of remembering the Holocaust in the time of forgetting in greater detail this Sunday, April 11th at 2 p.m. at the Florida Holocaust Museum, and this is in commemoration of Yom HaShoah. I'm Iris Ruth Pastor, a contributor to Let My People Know, which is an outreach engagement initiative.